The card arrived by courier. Not email, not a portal notification, not the automated rejection language that the industry had perfected into a kind of institutional anesthetic, language so smoothed and softened and sanded of all its edges that the person receiving it sometimes needed a moment to understand that what they were holding was a no. A courier. A cream-colored envelope, heavy stock, the kind of weight that communicates that the sender considers the message worth the material. The card inside was embossed with the Lumiere Fashion Week logo, a stylized L that the industry had recognized for 31 years as the signature of the event that mattered most. The message was 4 lines. Dear Ms. Okafor, after careful review of your submission to the Lumiere Spring Showcase, we regret that your collection does not meet the curatorial standards of this season's show. We wish you continued success in your work. Regards, Editorial Director, Garrison Cole. 4 lines. The woman who read them was named Adaeze Okafor. She was 34 years old. She had been designing for 11 years, building a label called Okafor Studio from a spare bedroom in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn into something that had been written about, carefully, specifically, with the language that serious fashion journalism reserves for things it considers important in 4 major publications in the past 2 years. She had a waiting list. She had clients who had found her without being told to find her, which is the most honest form of reputation. She had a collection. She had spent 14 months building, which was currently in a studio, on the 4th floor of a building on West 37th Street, hung in the particular silence of finished work waiting for its next moment. She read the 4 lines. She set the card on her work table between a pincushion and a length of silk the color of amber caught in afternoon light. She went back to work. She did not know yet that the cover of Lumiere magazine, the official publication of the event she had just been rejected from, was already at the printer. She did not know that on that cover, in the center of the frame, positioned with the deliberate geometry of an image that has been thought about and argued over and chosen from among 67 alternatives, was a dress. Her dress, the Okafor Studio Cascade gown, hand-sewn, 700 hours of labor. The dress that the editorial board of Lumiere magazine had selected, unanimously, 3 weeks before Garrison Cole sent his courier with his cream-colored envelope as the image that would define the season. They had selected it from a rack of submissions without knowing whose it was. Garrison Cole had sent the rejection without knowing it was already on the cover, and by the time anyone in that building understood what had happened, the magazine was already being loaded onto trucks. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Rewind 14 years. Adaeze Okafor learned to sew from her grandmother. This is not a metaphor, though it became one. It is a fact, plain and unhurried as the woman who taught her. Her grandmother's name was Ngozi, and she had come from Enugu to London to Brooklyn across the span of a life that had required more adaptation than most lives require, and she had carried 3 things intact through all of it: her faith, her language, and her hands. Her hands were the thing Adaeze remembered first when she remembered her grandmother. Not her face. Not her voice, though those came after. Her hands. Large and deliberate and completely certain of themselves. Hands that moved through fabric, the way water moves through landscape, finding the path without announcing it. Ngozi had made clothing for the family since before Adaeze was born. Not fashion, not design in the magazine sense, clothing. Things that fit, things that lasted, things that understood the body wearing them as a specific body rather than a general one. She made a dress for Adeze's mother for her parents' 35th anniversary that her mother kept unworn in tissue paper in the top of the closet for 20 years afterward because it was too important to use. She made school uniforms for Adeeze and her brother that lasted 3 years. When they should have lasted one, she made a suit for her son-in-law that he wore to every important occasion for a decade, and that still fit because Ngozi had understood how a man's body changes and had cut it accordingly. Adeeze started sitting with her at age 7. Not to learn, initially, to be near her. The sewing room was the room in the apartment that was warmest in the winter and that smelled of a specific combination of fabric and the cedar of the old chest where the materials were kept, and something that Adeeze eventually identified in her 30s as the smell of work being done well, which has its own fragrance. She sat and watched, and Ngozi let her watch without commentary, and then one afternoon, when Adeeze was 9, Ngozi handed her a threaded needle and a scrap of cotton and said, in Igbo, simply, begin. She did not explain what beginning meant. She did not demonstrate. She handed the needle and said, begin, and then went back to her own work because she was a woman who understood that certain things cannot be demonstrated and must only be attempted. Adeeze attempted. Badly, at first, and then less badly, and then with a growing competence that Ngozi acknowledged not with praise, but with more complex assignments, a hem, a seam, a dart. The particular challenge of a curved seam, which requires that you understand the relationship between the flat material and the dimensional form it will become, which requires fundamentally that you be capable of seeing before it exists. Adeeze was capable of that. Her brother was not particularly interested in sewing, which was fine. He was interested in mathematics, which turned out to be similarly useful. Their parents, her father an accountant, her mother an occupational therapist, were practical people in the specific way of people who have built a life from the right materials and know what the building required. They valued competence. They valued work. They had an equanimity about their children's particular competences that was not indifference, but its opposite. The active refusal to redirect a child's specific intelligence toward a safer or more familiar shape. Her mother said once, watching Adeeze at 16 work through a problem of a sleeve that would not set correctly. You have your grandmother's hands. Adeeze looked at her own hands. She said, I have my grandmother's patience. Her mother considered this. Those are the same thing, she said. She studied fashion design at a program in New York that was serious without being famous, which was the right place for her in the way that institutions that are serious without being famous are often the right place for the people who need to learn rather than to be seen learning. Her professors were practitioners, most of them, people who had made things and failed at making some of them and understood the full topology of the industry rather than its curated highlight. One of them, a woman named Professor Elena Marsh, had worked in Paris for 12 years before returning to teaching. and who had the specific authority of someone who has been inside the system long enough to understand exactly how it works and exactly where it fails. Professor Marsh looked at Adese's work at the end of her first year and said, "You are doing something that I want to describe carefully, because I don't want to describe it wrong. You are designing for the body as it is, not as the industry imagines it, as it actually is. Do you understand the distinction?" Adese said, "I think so." "Tell me," Professor Marsh said. Adese thought for a moment. "The industry designs a body and then puts a person in it," she said. "I'm trying to design the clothing, and then let the body tell me what it needs." Professor Marsh looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. Don't let anyone take that from you." She did not let anyone take it from her. It was not always easy to keep. The industry had preferences about scale, about proportion, about the prototype body on which ideas were tested and from which final pieces were extrapolated. The preferences were not stated. They were structural, embedded in the physical infrastructure of production, in the sizing conventions, in the fitting standards, in the vocabulary that the industry used when it described what it was looking for. The preferences were a system, and Adese had grown up watching systems, and she understood this one with the clarity of someone for whom the system's preferences had never included her. She built Okafor Studio in the space that the system's preferences had left empty. She designed for a range of bodies, a range of skin tones, a range of silhouettes that the industry had historically treated as secondary. Not because she was making a point, though she was making a point, but because these were the bodies she saw and respected and wanted to dress. She used color the way her grandmother used thread, with complete authority, without apology. She used fabric in ways that her professors had described as unconventional, and that her clients described as the reason they had sought her out specifically. She had, by her mid-30s, built something real: the waiting list, the publications, the clients who found her without being told. She had a studio assistant named Priya, who had left a larger house to work at Okafor Studio, and who said, in her first week, that she had taken the job because the work was honest, which was the highest compliment Adese had ever received about the label. And she had the collection. 14 months of work. 12 pieces, each one a specific conversation between form and movement. The centerpiece was a gown she had titled internally, in her sketchbook, as the Cascade, a floor-length structure in layered organza that she had developed over a period of 4 months, adjusting the layering in 7 different iterations before the 8th one became the thing she had been trying to make. It was amber and gold, and a deep rust that shifted in different light, and it was structured in the bodice and released in the skirt in a way that created in motion an effect she had not planned but recognized immediately when she first saw it on the dress form: the impression of something in the act of becoming, something mid-transformation, something that had not yet arrived at what it would be. She had submitted the collection to Lumiere Fashion Week 6 weeks before the courier arrived. Garrison Cole had been the editorial director of the Lumiere Fashion Week showcase for 11 years. He was 53, the product of a particular lineage of fashion institutions. The right schools, the right houses, the right mentorships, the right cities in the right order. and he had the specific confidence of a man who has been told, repeatedly, and by credible sources, that his taste is what the industry needs. He was not without genuine knowledge. He had an eye, in the way the industry uses that word, meaning a developed capacity to recognize within the existing parameters of what the industry considers excellent. He was good at what he had been trained to see. He was less good at what he had not been trained to see. The submission process for the Lumiere showcase required designers to submit a portfolio, a collection description, and 2 to 4 physical pieces for initial review. The physical pieces were received, logged, and placed on a rack in the review room, where the curatorial team examined them. The portfolio and collection description were filed separately and cross-referenced after the physical review. This process had been designed years before Garrison Cole's tenure to allow the physical work to be evaluated before the accompanying context. The designer's name, background, previous press, institutional affiliations could influence the assessment. It was, in principle, a system designed to let the work speak first. In practice, under Garrison Cole's leadership, the system had a modification. The physical review was conducted by the full curatorial team. The portfolio review, the step at which the designer's identity and background were examined, was conducted by Garrison Cole alone before the full team's recommendations were finalized. He had introduced this step in his 3rd year as editorial director, and it had not been formally documented as a change to the process. It had simply become the process. When the Okafor Studio submission arrived, the physical pieces, including the cascade gown, were placed on the review rack with the other submissions. The curatorial team, 7 people, reviewed them over 2 days. Their notes on the Okafor pieces were consistent. Exceptional technical construction, original use of layering, unusual color deployment. That was described by 3 of the 7 reviewers as among the strongest work in the submission pool. The cascade gown was specifically noted by 5 reviewers, 2 of whom used the word extraordinary. The recommendations went to Garrison Cole. He reviewed the portfolio. He sent the courier. The magazine process had run on a separate track. Lumiere magazine, the official publication of the showcase, operated with editorial independence from the showcase curation, a separation that had been intentional from the magazine's founding, and that was maintained by the magazine's editor-in-chief, a woman named Helena Voss, who had been in her role for 7 years and who treated editorial independence as non-negotiable in the specific way that people treat things as non-negotiable when they have seen what happens when they are negotiated. The magazine's annual spring showcase issue was built around a cover image that was selected through its own internal process, separate from the showcase's curatorial decisions. The cover selection team, Helena Voss, her creative director, 2 senior editors, and a stylist, reviewed a wide range of submitted work from across the industry, not limited to the showcase selections. The submission process was managed by the magazine's assistant editor, who received, cataloged, and presented the submissions without the designer identification attached, because Helena Voss had instituted this practice in her 2nd year as editor-in-chief after becoming concerned that the cover selection was being influenced by name recognition rather than the quality of the work itself. The Okafor studio submission to the magazine had arrived through a separate channel from the showcase submission, submitted on Adize's behalf by a stylist she had worked with twice who had seen the cascade gown in the studio and sent the images to the magazine's submission portal on her own initiative without fully informing Adize she was doing so. The images arrived. They were cataloged. They were presented to the cover selection team without the designer's name attached. The team selected the cascade gown unanimously. The cover was photographed, designed, approved, and sent to the printer 16 days before Garrison Cole's courier arrived at Adize's studio. Adize learned about the cover on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the rejection. The call came from Helena Voss directly. This was unusual. Helena Voss did not typically make calls of this nature herself. She had staff for the logistics of licensing and credit arrangements. She called directly because she had been made aware, through a conversation with her assistant editor, that the designer of the cover gown had received a rejection from the showcase the previous week, and she wanted to make the call herself because she believed the situation required someone who understood its full dimensions. She said, "She'd, Mrs. Okafor, this is Helena Voss. I am calling because the spring showcase issue of Lumiere magazine is going to press with your gown on the cover, and I wanted you to hear that from me before you saw it anywhere else." Adize was at her work table. She was working on a sleeve. She set the sleeve down. She said, "I'm sorry?" Helena Voss said, "The cascade gown. We selected it for the spring cover. Unanimously. It goes to press Friday." A silence. Adize said, "I received a rejection from the showcase on Monday." Helena Voss said, "I know." And then, after a pause that had the quality of someone choosing their next words with considerable care, "I became aware of that this morning. I want to be clear that the magazine's cover selection process is independent of the showcase's curatorial process. Our selection was made 3 weeks before your rejection was issued." Adize said, "Your selection was made before the rejection." Yes. Another silence. Adize looked at the amber silk on her work table. She looked at the pincushion and the card from Garrison Cole that was still sitting between them because she had not yet moved it. She said, "What would you like me to do?" Helena Voss said, "Nothing. I'm calling to tell you to confirm licensing and credit arrangements and to ask whether you would be willing to attend the cover reveal event, which is on the same evening as the opening of the showcase." Adize said, "The same evening." Yes. Adize picked up Garrison Cole's card from the work table. She read the 4 lines again. She set it back down. She said, "Sa'll be there." The Lumiere Fashion Week opening night was held on the last Thursday of March at the Meridian Center, a venue that had been hosting the event for 22 years, and that had the specific, accumulated dignity of a space that has witnessed enough significant moments to have developed its own gravity. The showcase and the magazine's cover reveal were separate events within the same evening. The showcase in the main hall, the magazine reveal in the atrium that connected the main hall to the street entrance. Garrison Cole arrived at 6:15. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the particular expression of a man who is comfortable in a room he has organized. He greeted the people he knew, which was nearly everyone. He moved through the space with the ease of someone for whom this room has been, for 11 years, a reliable confirmation of his position in the world. He did not know about the cover. He had not read the advance press materials for the magazine event, because the magazine event was not his event, and he had 11 years of experience treating what was not his event as not his concern. He walked through the atrium at 6:47 on his way to the main hall. He stopped at the magazine's display installation, a large format print of the cover image, 7 feet, mounted on a free-standing board at the center of the atrium, draped in white linen, awaiting the reveal at 7. He did not know what was under the linen. He stopped because Helena Voss was standing near the display with a small group that included a photographer, 2 editors, and a woman in a deep amber dress whom he recognized after a moment as the woman in the portfolio he had reviewed and rejected 3 days earlier. He looked at the draped display board. He looked at her. He said, "Mrs. Okafor." The way a person says a name when they are using the act of naming to buy time for the thoughts to catch up to the face. Adeze said, "Mr. Cole." She was composed in the way that people are composed when they have had 3 days to understand a situation and have decided how they want to occupy it. Helena Voss said, "Garrison, are you joining us for the reveal?" He said, "Yes." "Yes, of course." The linen came down at 7 o'clock. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when they encounter something they recognize as important before they have finished identifying why. The cascade gown filled the 7-foot frame, amber and gold, and the deep rust that shifted in the atrium lighting, structured in the bodice, released in the skirt, the layered organza catching the light, the way her grandmother's hands caught thread. Deliberately, completely, without a single wasted motion. The dress was, at 7 feet, exactly what it had been in the studio on West 37th Street. And it was, on the cover of Lumiere magazine, exactly what it had been on the dress form in Adese's studio at 2 in the morning when she first saw what she had made and understood that the 8th iteration was the thing. Garrison Cole stood in the atrium and looked at the cover. He looked at it for a long time. Photographer was working the room. One of the images he took in the next 10 minutes was of Garrison Cole, standing in front of the Lumiere cover, the cascade gown filling the frame behind him, with an expression that the photographer described later to a colleague as a man discovering that the ground has already shifted under him and that the shifting had been underway for some time without his knowledge. That photograph was published the following morning by a fashion industry news site that had been covering the showcase for 8 years. The caption read, "Lumiere editorial director Garrison Cole at the spring showcase opening, in front of the magazine cover featuring Okafor Studio, whose collection Cole's team declined to include in this year's showcase. It was the most shared image from the opening night of Lumiere Fashion Week by 9 o'clock the following morning." The industry conversation that followed was not, to its credit, primarily about Garrison Cole. It was primarily about the work. This was in part because Helena Voss declined to discuss the specifics of the showcase's rejection in the interview she gave to the industry, publication that reached her first, and in part because Adeze Okafor gave an interview to the same publication the following week that declined to center the rejection and centered instead the collection, the design philosophy, the 14 months of work, the 7 iterations of the cascade gown that had preceded the one on the cover. She said, in that interview, one sentence about the rejection, and only one. The work was evaluated twice by two different processes, and one of those processes knew what it was looking at. She said nothing else about it. She did not need to say anything else about it. The interview was read widely. It was shared in the fashion industry and outside it, because it was, fundamentally, not about fashion. It was about the relationship between systems of evaluation and the things they systematically fail to evaluate, and this is a subject on which many people across many fields have opinions rooted in personal experience. The cover itself was on newsstands the following Monday. The response to the cover was immediate and specific. Readers and industry observers described the image in consistent terms: striking, original, the kind of cover that you remember in the category of covers that made you understand what the magazine could be when it was being what it should be. Orders for the issue were 40% above the spring average. 3 major retailers requested the issue for extended placement. The Okafor Studio website received 11,000 visitors on Monday, 12,000 on Tuesday. The waiting list, which had been running at approximately 3 months, extended to 7 months by Wednesday afternoon. A buyer from a department store that Adeze had been in conversation with for 2 years called on Thursday and finalized an agreement that afternoon. Priya, the studio assistant, who had left a larger house because the work was honest, sent a message at 9 in the evening on Thursday that said, simply, 7 months. Adeze wrote back, 8 months by Friday. She was right. It was 8 months by Friday. Garrison Cole issued a statement through the Flumiere Fashion Week Communications office 12 days after the opening night. The statement acknowledged that a significant work had not been selected for this season's showcase and committed to a review of the curatorial process with the aim of ensuring that the standards applied are consistent with Lumiere's stated commitment to excellence across the full range of contemporary design. The statement was 4 sentences long. The 4th sentence said that Garrison Cole would be stepping back from his role as editorial director to allow the review to proceed under independent guidance. The statement did not use the word resignation. 3 months later, Garrison Cole's departure was confirmed as permanent. The independent review of the curatorial process took 4 months and was conducted by a panel that included Helena Voss, 2 external curators with no prior affiliation with the Lumiere Showcase, and a former designer who had served on the board of the industry's Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. The review's findings were published in full on the Lumiere website, an unusual transparency that Helena Voss had advocated for and that the board had accepted after considering the alternative. The findings identified 4 structural elements in the curatorial process that had created conditions for subjective bias to influence selection outcomes. The specific modification that Garrison Cole had introduced, the post-team Sole Director Portfolio Review, was identified as the primary mechanism through which the process had been compromised. The review noted that this modification had never been formally documented as a change to the stated process, which meant that it had operated for 8 years without oversight. The reforms implemented in response were specific and numbered. The portfolio review was returned to the full curatorial team, a blind submission process. The physical work reviewed before the portfolio was examined, was formalized in writing, and made part of the publicly stated process. An independent curatorial Ombudsperson was appointed to review final selection decisions before announcement, a mentorship initiative connecting established showcase designers with emerging designers from underrepresented backgrounds, was funded with a portion of the showcase's annual budget. The mentorship initiative was named the Okafor Studio Fellowship, with Adize's permission, which she granted after asking one question: "Will it be about the work?" The answer was yes. She said yes. The following March, Adize Okafor showed at Lumiere Fashion Week, not in the main hall, in the space adjacent to it, a venue that was smaller and had been used for invited special presentations for years, which was, her team agreed, the right frame for the collection, not the main hall, the space where the work could be seen the way it needed to be seen, closer, without the distance that the main hall required between the audience and the thing. She showed 12 pieces. The collection was called Becoming, which was the word she had used in her sketchbook when she was trying to name what the cascade gown was doing, and could not find the word and eventually realized it had been there all along. The cascade gown opened the show. It moved the way it had always moved. The layered organza releasing from the bodice, the amber and gold and rust shifting in the light, the impression that the fabric was in the act of becoming something it had not yet arrived at. 700 hours, 8 iterations, 14 months, a grandmother's hands, 9 years of a studio on West 37th Street. The body of knowledge that had accumulated without fanfare in the space the industry had left empty. In the audience, in the third row, was Helena Voss. Beside her was Professor Elena Marsh, who had said, "Don't let anyone take that from you," and who was here because Adize had called her 2 weeks before the show and said simply, "I would like you to see the collection." Beside Professor Marsh was a woman named Ngozi Okafor, who was 81 years old, and who had come from Brooklyn in a car that Adize had arranged, and who sat in the third row of the Lumiere Fashion Week special presentation with the particular stillness of someone whose hands have been in this work for 60 years, and who recognizes, without needing to say anything about it, what it looks like when the work becomes what it was always going to become. The cascade gown passed in front of her. She watched it. She did not say anything. She put her hand over her heart. That was enough. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. The part that stays with me, the thing I find I cannot put at a comfortable distance, the image that arrives uninvited while I am doing other things, is not the cover reveal. It is not the photograph of Garrison's Cole standing in front of the 7-foot image of the dress he had rejected. It is the work table, the cream-colored card between the pin-cushioned and the amber silk, the 4 lines that Adize's read, and then set down, and then went back to work. Not dramatically, not in the kind of demonstrated defiance that is itself a form of performance. She simply went back to work, as though the card were information rather than verdict, as though the absence of the system's recognition were a fact about the system rather than a fact about the work. This is the discipline I find hardest to name and most important to understand. The discipline of knowing the difference between a verdict on yourself and a verdict on the evaluator, of receiving a rejection and being able to locate the error, not in yourself, but in the process that produced the rejection, of not absorbing an institution's blind spot as a truth about your own vision. Adaeze Okafor had not been waiting for Garrison Cole's system to tell her what her work was worth. She had been developing that knowledge for 34 years, starting at a grandmother's knee with a threaded needle and a scrap of cotton and the word begin. The system's failure to recognize the work was not new information. It was a data point in a pattern she had been observing since she was a girl. She filed it in the place. She filed everything she knew before she could, and she went back to work. The universal truth this story asks us to carry is about the relationship between systems of evaluation and the things those systems are structured, often invisibly, to exclude. Every industry has a Garrison Cole, not necessarily a person, often a process, often something that was introduced quietly in someone's third year, without formal documentation, without oversight, without anyone noticing that the stated process and the actual process had quietly diverged. And every industry has a Helena Voss, the separate track, the process that was designed to let the work speak first. Before the name, before the institutional history, before the accumulated assumptions about what excellence looks like and where it comes from and who is capable of producing it. The question I need to leave you with tonight is not about fashion. It is about the process you are inside right now. Whatever field, whatever room, whatever system of evaluation is currently holding your work or your name or your potential in its hands. Is it looking at the work or is it looking at the portfolio? Leave the answer in the comments. One word, the truest one you have tonight. One word. If this story reached you, pass it to one person who has received the 4-line card, who has read the regret and the curatorial standards, and the continued success, and has set the card down on the work table between the pincushion and the silk. Tell them about the cover. Tell them about what was already at the printer. Tell them that the work has its own track, and that track does not require the system's permission to arrive at the cover. Subscribe if you haven't. This channel exists because the most important stories are the ones in which someone goes back to work when they had every reason not to, and the work becomes what it was always going to become. Next time, we go inside a small-town bank in Mississippi where a black farmer was denied a loan for the 14th time, and what happened 8 months later when he walked into that same bank as the new majority owner, carrying the deed. And the loan officer who had denied him every time was sitting across the desk, waiting to learn who his new employer was. The folder he opened that morning changes everything you think you know about what patience can build. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. I'll see you then.